This is The Based Catholic, because Catholicism should be the base of all hot takes.
All the cool kids now are unwoke, and some of them are going back to Christianity because it's the only way to be rebellious. You know, everybody's blue-haired, non-binary, and that's like, it's the cover of Newsweek, so you have to be like a Catholic saying the rosary to be a problem now.
Yeah.
This current world that we've created spiritually, it's about money and profit, and everything has no history or tradition. Everything's so disorienting. People are going back to things that root them.
And now your host, Jessica Kramer.
Welcome to The Based Catholic. This is Jessica Kramer, your daily host. Today we have a jam-packed show where we're going to discuss abortion from a based perspective now that Roe v. Wade is overturned. I have a very special co-host, Marlo Slayback, with me today, who is ironically expecting her first baby. And later on in this episode, we have Dr. Abigail Favale. You might have seen her on Pints with Aquinas. And Terry Schilling, you might recognize him from Tucker, to continue this based conversation. Marlo and I come from the conservative world of journalism and politics. I had her on my YouTube channel a while back to discuss a piece that she wrote on the concept of trad wives, and it did pretty well. We got over 10,000 views, so I'm really excited that we get to do this again. Marlo, I know that we saw each other over the summer. How are the last couple weeks of pregnancy going?
Going pretty well. It's very hot out, so that's been certainly kind of, it's first trimester, and then the last few weeks of the third trimester have been kind of rough. This is my first child, so it's my first rodeo, but otherwise no complaints. I'm really excited to welcome baby boy outside of the womb and be able to meet him. And I'm actually sitting next to a huge pile of baby stuff that we've been compiling over the past few weeks. So looking forward to finally putting that all to use.
Oh, that's so exciting. Do you have a name yet?
I do. Joseph, after St. Joseph.
Oh, I love Joseph. I love both Josephs in the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament.
Yeah, when me and my husband were thinking about names, we're like, this is our first baby. But we were like, do we want to be creative, or do we want to go with a classic and have, St. Joseph be the patron saint? So we're like, we've asked for his intercession on so many accounts over the past year that this is our kind of way of, I guess, paying homage to him. Maybe we'll get more creative with, God willing, subsequent children.
And then you're also doing a home birth. Do you want to tell any of our listeners about that experience so far? It's post-COVID. I feel like everything is just a little bit weird with anything in the hospital. So I feel like a home birth actually sounds it sounds scary depending on the pregnancy, but
right.
It sounds nice in a way.
Yeah, so it's funny because the home birth movement is, I hesitate to even call it a movement, but it kind of started with the hippies, which is so interesting because there's kind of a horseshoe theory of the type of person that pursues a home birth nowadays. It's been either crunchy hippies, which is how the entire kind of appeal started back in, the 1970s. And then it's also, more conservative, pharmaceutical skeptic, medical establishment skeptics like me and my husband. We're by no means, absolutists in that regard. But during COVID, there was a bit of a surge in home birth interest, and the rates are a bit lower in the US than they are in Europe. Having a midwife is much more common in, I think it's the Netherlands, actually. A large percentage of women have midwives, and seeking out home birth is much more common there than it is here. But yeah, it's been, honestly, if you're pregnant and you're considering your options, I recommend home birth as an alternative. Our midwife has been fantastic. Our support has been fantastic. I feel really confident about this, alternative to giving birth at a hospital. Of course, you kind of have to be low risk, which I am, fortunately, but it's been an incredible experience. I've definitely felt much more empowered in my pregnancy, and it's definitely been a great bonding experience for me this entire time with my unborn child, because it kind of takes out the whole viewing your pregnancy as a medical event and more of a, this incredible experience that you have for 9 months. And of course, that comes with a lot of sacrifice and unpleasant symptoms. But I think I definitely was able to experience the fullness of pregnancy and all of the occasional discomfort, but also the beauty of it by pursuing that.
Yeah. Well, it's so funny that you said that the crunchy hippies are the ones that are naturally drawn to it. I feel like it would be a natural draw for Catholic women. They use natural family planning. We prefer things natural. We trust our bodies. We think that there's something magnificent about the way that God created them. So it does seem to me that most Catholics would be drawn to that if they can. I know my friend, went to a birth center so that she could kind of position herself in more comfortable positions. She had a midwife there, so it felt less intrusive. So I think there's probably a lot of women that are drawn to that.
Yeah, I mean, my home parish where I got married and where I'm hoping to have our son baptized probably a few weeks at this rate, there's a lot of pretty big families there. So I do come across a lot of women who did seek out home birth, and it's a traditional Latin Mass community. So I definitely see that more of a commonality in those types of conservative Catholic communities. That's very much so a not reflective of the common population, but you definitely learn to trust your body as God created it. That's been the most, I think, empowering message that I've received, even though my midwives are more secular and that's their approach to midwifery, being able to trust that, the engineering is working for me, that I know when to push because God created, he's this masterful engineer that can send these signals through my body that I'm able to, through, my anatomy, that I'm able to know how to approach child rearing and childbirth. I think that's been the single most helpful thing that perhaps I would have missed out on had I gone through a hospital setting in this process.
So when we met in DC, we had this conversation because I saw you pregnant and you wore it so well. Very cute.
I appreciate that.
I was like, she's so cute pregnant. And we were talking, and what I loved is that you had this really honest realization that you kind of came to throughout your pregnancy of, well, first of all, the observation that I'm already a mother, the reality of pregnancy. And then also just the transition that you were feeling as a woman, because you're kind of going from this, girl persona into being a mother. I just feel like that transition is probably even more dramatic than, just getting married. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that because you wrote a piece, you were out there searching for something that could kind of speak to that transition and that reality, and you couldn't find anything. And so you wrote about it and you spoke about the reality of pregnancy, which I think ties in nicely to what we're going to talk about later in the show, about the Dobbs decision. But, you made this observation that it's not a prelude to motherhood, but the defining part of it. And I think that gets lost in the conversation on abortion because, people think that there's still a choice during pregnancy when the reality is that you're already a mother. There's a mother-child relationship already happening.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I wrote that piece, it was during the period where the Dobbs decision was, impending. It was going to drop any day now. And the reason why I wrote it was just as you suggested, there is not only the kind of discourse surrounding, when life even begins, but when motherhood begins, I mean, there's always, these kind of, the approach to, greeting a newborn child is welcome to the world. And I was just thinking, that's cute and all. And I'm sure people don't mean anything by it more than, just kind of it's just a salutation that's kind of ingrained in how we approach the newborn, like literally exiting the birth canal at the hospital. But I don't know, I from the moment, I realized I was pregnant, I was like, I am mothering this child because I'm avoiding foods that I normally would selfishly indulge in. I feel sick all the time. I'm doing things that are for the sake of my child, not myself. It's a sacrifice that I'd never experienced before. That was purely out of the welfare of my unborn child. And, that only grows throughout your pregnancy and it starts in the first trimester. I mean, I think it's hard to visualize the first trimester because we often don't see, it takes some time for women to actually be showing, but that's when the sacrifice begins. It begins by abstaining from alcohol the moment that you realize that you have this small defenseless person inside of you. And it leads up to, the moments in your second, third trimester where you're maybe not able to exercise like you used to be able to. You have to kind of shed the selfishness and even surrender to the pregnancy in a way that you're taking on a new body.
There's this thing that happens when you get pregnant. No one talks about this. But you mourn a little bit. You mourn, the person that you used to be. Because the fact is, no matter how much you want to be a mom, you're never not going to be one again. Not to freak you.
Okay.
That is a huge brain adjustment. You are letting go of your old self.
Something that I had to get over was not being able to fit in my clothing. That was a huge transition for me. I'm like, I had to tell myself, I'm no longer, that's kind of the Marlo of my youth. that was beforehand. And now this is a whole new role for me. I'm a mother now, and I should really learn to appreciate that with the sacrifices that come along with it. But it is kind of a new station of life.
Yeah, I went home recently and I saw a girl that I was friends with a couple years ago, and now she's married. She has a baby girl, and she looks great. Like, she doesn't even look like she had a kid, but she made this comment, kind of like, I guess I'm going to have to accept that I'm just going to be one of these frumpy moms now. But she said it almost in a way where she was like, you know what? I accept it because this is the new life that I have. Like, This is the new reality. And, my body has a different purpose now. It's not just for me. And then you spoke about, meeting your baby for the first time, this person who is more intimately known to you than any other person, but simultaneously unknown. And I think to tease out our next segment, do you think it's this unknowingness of the other inside of you that makes it easier for women to have an abortion? Do you feel like you need to know your child in order to love him? Because sometimes I wonder, what the experience of pregnancy would be like in reverse if you already knew your child the way that you eventually will know your child. And would that love somehow make you appreciate or experience it differently?
Yeah, so I think love is a choice. That's something that I've learned through even marriage, just approaching marriage in, a way that's with compassion and just being realistic with myself about the expectations of loving my spouse. It's a choice. And you have to, at the beginning of your pregnancy, you can't see your child. An ultrasound will not render an image that looks like we did when we were, infants, newly born infants. And that's a very recognizable image to a lot of people. So it's understandable that not having that image for us can kind of create this kind of discrepancy.
Yeah, you have to use your imagination.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a lack of imagination about where we come from, how humans are formed, what humanity even looks like. It can look like something as small as, a creature that can't be seen unless it's underneath a microscope. And we fully appreciate that fact because we recognize tons of animals as being forms of life, but they're microscopic. So why can't we see the human child that is unborn and a few weeks old in the womb is one either?
We've been having a great conversation about the reality of pregnancy with Marlo Slayback. When we come back, we're going to continue that discussion in connection to the Dobbs decision. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Stay tuned. We're back with Marlo Slayback, shifting gears now to discuss the Dobbs decision. So I feel like when the Dobbs decision came out, it became kind of a where were you when Roe v. Wade was overturned moment. But to be honest, for me, it kind of felt like the start of something rather than the end of it. Marlo, I wanted to ask your initial thoughts when that decision finally came out.
Yeah, it was funny. Well, not funny. It was just a moment of such joy. I was at work and I was obsessively refreshing my Twitter feed as I do. And the SCOTUS blog account on Twitter notified everyone that the decision was dropped and Roe v. Wade was overturned. And I just started crying tears of joy, going through the office like a child on Christmas morning, telling everyone about the news. And so it was a moment that I did not think I would I maybe wouldn't see in my lifetime, let alone this year. Maybe that kind of indicates I'm cynical or something, but maybe I'm just a realist. I don't know. Yeah. I was full of just gratitude and joy, and so many prayers have been answered on my, prayers that I've prayed. Also, obviously, millions of very dedicated activists.
You know what? I love that was your reaction. I had the total opposite reaction. I mean, in a way, it was surreal. I couldn't believe it. I didn't really think I was ever going to see that. But at the same time, I was fittingly at the Theology of the Body retreat with Christopher West, and that news breaks, and we were in the middle of a session, and then we just stopped and prayed, and he has the Eucharist exposed the entire time, and it was a great moment. However, he did warn us, and I thought it was so poignant. He said, do not get caught up in the media frenzy. He's like, this decision will end up opening up a whole plethora of conversations and debates and potentially a war. I mean, he really kind of took it as take this to prayer, reflect on what you learned and what you went over. Because I told him, I was like, I work in the media. How am I going to avoid, commenting, being a part of this? Ironically, I tore my ACL, so I was on crutches, so I couldn't do any of the protest coverage. But, I've been reflecting on it since then, and have been trying to come up with something in terms of writing that I think is kind of where my mind is, because it's in so many different places. I mean, this really just opens up the field for discussion when it comes to abortion, which is such a huge topic. And I wanted us to dive into that. So
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point, though, is I think it was Fulton Sheen who brought up, that demons and evil are attracted to goodness. And with such, goodness, and I do want to be clear that, the opinion didn't affirm the value of inherent to every to every unborn child. The opinion was they explicitly said that it was not based on any view about if and when prenatal life is entitled to any of the rights enjoyed after birth. But, obviously it is a victory. It's a great triumph, but also evil is attracted to goodness. And this is a good, outcome for millions of unborn children, but we also shouldn't falter in our activism and making sure that Catholics and other pro-life activists are, keeping up their work, because I know, for example, the Knights of Columbus do amazing work providing ultrasound technology to pro-life centers. And as we spoke about in our previous segment, it's so important for women to be able to see, just rendered on even if it's a black and white image, it might be a little grainy, just exactly the child that's growing inside of them. So I'm hoping that more Catholics feel, the encouragement of this victory and don't, kind of fall back or maybe think that this is the end all be all of the pro-life movement. It's really a moment for us to step up our efforts, especially as I think a lot of demonic influences will be drawn, unfortunately, to our efforts and try to hinder them.
Yeah. I mean, all it did was strip the constitutional right to abortion away. But I mean, the question of human life is now going to be rendered back to the states. And I mean, we've already seen in other states, they're amping up their, pro-abortion services, allowing or trying to provide money and funds for women across state lines. And then other pro-life states, kind of have watered down a lot of their arguments, are making exceptions and, for rape, incest, health of the mother, allowing those. So, and obviously, there's so many issues within the pro-life movement that I've kind of seen over the years that I would like to see fixed moving forward, because, this undoing of Roe really has given us an opportunity to redefine ourselves as the pro-life movement, just like, Trump has kind of opened up this window for conservatives to redefine themselves outside of the GOP, mainstream DC bubble. Right. So I just think that this is a really big moment, and I really hope that Catholics step in and, reclaim the pro-life movement and our Catholic identity, because, the reality is I was at the TOB retreat and I was like, John Paul II has articulated the answer to this millennia's, prevailing question of man's identity. The answer is within the church. And if we can find a way to articulate that in, the modern scene, then I think we'll have a better chance of victory.
Yeah, it is, especially communicating right now more than ever, you kind of see the, adverse impact of the waters we swim in, which is, this deeply rooted liberalism that makes it hard for people to, even if you kind of strip it of the metaphysical deepness that Catholic theology adds to the conversation about when we and why we look at life in as unborn life as something that ought to be protected at all costs. It's kind of interesting, speaking to people who now look at abortion as not the, safe, legal, and rare of a few decades ago, but as a positive good, which has been extremely disturbing. Yeah, exactly. They're more honest. And I don't know, what do you think about, do you think that's better that they're being more honest about their thoughts on this?
I do.
It is disturbing, though.
I would prefer to have, this is what I found amazing when I was doing the Alito protest coverage is, the pro-abortion protesters, they know where this fight is going. And I was in agreement with them. I'm yeah, it's ultimately going to come down to the question of religion, because, they see that abortion is connected to birth control and gay marriage and obscenity and all these other, social issues. They see that connection. A lot of people in the pro-life movement want to act oh, this won't affect gay marriage. This won't affect birth control. It should, though.
Absolutely.
And then they also see that, this comes down to the question of, theology and philosophy, because that's what gives value to life, is a worldview. The more that we make secular arguments and try to rely on biology to win over people to our side, I just don't think it gets us very far, because ultimately it's not a question of when life begins. That's easy to answer. It's a question of the reality of pregnancy and just addressing the fact that there is a sacred relationship between mother and child, and that we really shouldn't be putting women in a position where they're being pit against their child. The more we can get away from defending the right to life for the unborn child, and I think we'll do better, because ultimately if we're relying on rights, the child's rights are always going to lose to the woman's rights, because, in our culture, we view rights as, this ability to dominate over another instead of using my power for another's weakness on behalf of the other.
Yeah, and I also think that an interesting point that has come out of this, and you kind of touched on this, is the role of the mother. I accept that, the reality is there will be women who perhaps, instead of, killing their child, will opt to perhaps, consider foster care, adoption, which is obviously far more preferable than killing an innocent being. But what I think we don't talk about enough is that the role of the biological mother will and always will be, is and always will be, it cannot be filled in its absence by anyone. That's why the conversation surrounding surrogacy, whenever
yes.
people are, that's, I think, one of the kind of social pathologies that we absolutely need to be definitively, unequivocal on, is that mother, all mothers, will be biologically attached to their children forever, whether that child is, given up for adoption, whether they're given up via surrogacy, or even the conversation, the kind of like counter, they think it's like this, own on social media. It's like, well, conservatives should, amp up their game and trying to, or like they should support making sure that fathers stay in the picture, and fathers should face some sort of repercussions legally or whatever for leaving. I absolutely agree. That would be fantastic. But we need to, before we get there, we need to accept that the role of the mother will never be filled by a father, by a adoptive mother. The biological mother is that their role is stamped on the heart of a child forever, and on the soul of a child, and whether that child is deceased or living, that role cannot be filled by anyone else. So I think that that's also another point that Catholics need to make sure to emphasize and not feel like they have to veer away from it, because it's maybe something that's harder to digest. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Oh, yes.
The surrogacy one really bothers me.
Yes. Well, the surrogacy one is hard because you've got a biological mother, but then you've got the woman carrying the child. So it's kind of these two different aspects coming at it. But, and obviously we would, want a woman to give up her child rather than kill it. But I think there's this cultural, we allow people to just get rid of their responsibility. And I think that's what bothers me the most is, and this is part of, one of the issues that I have in the pro-life movement is that we treat women as victims. We kind of take on the role of substituting for men that are not in the picture when we should be holding them responsible. But it's not even just like a financial responsibility. Like, these children need fathers in their lives. They need fathers in the homes. So, even if they were, held responsible for giving a check to this child for 18 years, that doesn't actually replace what the child actually needs. Same thing with how we kind of treat women. We kind of treat them like they're not moral agents. And obviously I'm not talking about victims of rape or incest, but for most women in unplanned pregnancies, everybody goes into the sexual act with the knowledge that this could create a human life. Mm-hmm. Even if you are using birth control, that can fail. And so, even with the adoption thing, that it always kind of made me sad when you would find out about these women that gave up their children when maybe they were a teenager, and then they end up having a family. And, coming from a family where there's a lot of women that were young and unwed mothers, I can't imagine not having the family members in my life that if the women in my life felt differently, wouldn't be here, whether through abortion or even adoption, just not knowing your sibling. So I think these are all parts of like the conversation that no one really wants to have, because it kind of comes down to just holding people accountable to their actions. And in our culture, no one wants to do that. And so I think a lot of it comes down to, talking about the reality of sex and getting that right first. Addressing the root of abortion, which is a, depraved sexual ethic. You're listening to The Base Catholic. We've enjoyed discussing the reality of pregnancy with our co-host today, Marlo Slayback. We talked about how abortion is seen in America through the liberal lens of personal bodily autonomy and rights, and not seen as the already existing sacred relationship between mother and child that it is. When we come back, I'm going to continue themes of this conversation with Dr. Abigail Favale from the University of Notre Dame. You don't want to miss that. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Base Catholic. I'm your host, Jessica Kramer. We're here with Dr. Abigail Favale, who just started teaching at the University of Notre Dame. She's a former Protestant like myself, an academic and former feminist, and I'm just really excited to have her on and pick her brain a little bit. Dr. Favale, I know you were a former progressive prior to your conversion to Catholicism, and I wanted your thoughts on whether or not you thought that progressives should be the face of the movement, because in many respects they are, or even have a voice in the movement. And if, since your conversion, you also feel a need for a more solid and uniformed Catholic identity and worldview leading the pro-life movement moving forward.
Well, those are good questions. So I guess my impression, and I could very well be wrong, my impression is very much that the pro-life movement in America is still seen as a conservative phenomenon. So there might be kind of tokenism when it comes to progressives, but I don't see the progressives as being the new face of the movement. I don't know. Is there something I'm missing?
Well, I think, so I work in DC and I cover a lot of protests that were happening during the whole Dobbs saga. There's a group of progressives that are the face of the movement. A lot of them have, I'm vegan, I'm feminist, I'm liberal, I'm atheist signs out there. They're really at the forefront with Students for Life at a lot of these rallies and protests. And a lot of them are being interviewed in news outlets, and a lot of them are making more secular arguments. And so, my concern, I guess, as a Catholic is just that we're kind of losing the arguments by allowing them to make the secular arguments, because I ultimately think this issue is going to come down to a question of religion. So I guess I'm asking, as a former progressive, where you might have had maybe pro-life progressive friends, do you see that as a contribution to the movement, or do you think that they're kind of playing in two different worlds? Because what was interesting was at the Alito protests, some pro-abortion protesters were actually calling them out, saying, after they come after our rights, you don't think that they're going to be coming after yours too. Because a lot of these individuals identify as LGBTQ, trans, and so they were kind of pointing out, you might agree with the pro-lifers on this issue, but when it comes to the other issues in the sexual realm, you're probably going to be on opposing sides.
Right. So I guess my thought is that I think it would be great for the pro-life movement not to be caught up in American political tribalism primarily, right? So I guess it wouldn't be good if it were seen as just a progressive phenomenon. Also, I don't think it's good for it to be seen as just a conservative phenomenon. So I think that the pro-life movement and the pro-life ethic cuts against some of the political boundaries that are increasingly polarized in American society. So any efforts that I guess violate those neat little boundaries, those neat lines, I would say are great. So I also don't think there's a danger in partnering with people who are coming from making secular arguments, right? So I do think that there's more than one argument to be made in favor of a pro-life ethic. And there are secular arguments that can be made. Does that mean that there's an entire unified shared worldview between a Catholic perspective and a secular perspective? No. Does that mean that secular people might have some cognitive dissonance? That might well be the case, but that's not necessarily bad, right? So I can look at my own intellectual journey and see times where I'm like, oh, I was really living in a state of cognitive dissonance here. But does that mean that the part of me that was holding on to what is good and true was bad, and that I should have instead have just been more, consistent and embraced only what is bad? You know what I'm saying? So I really do think that Catholicism has a robust tradition of partnering with people of goodwill who come from different perspectives. And so I really think trying to resist like an us versus them political tribalism would be the way to go.
Okay. I can see that point. I think my concern was just that, when we're making these life begins at conception through science arguments, a lot of really honest pro-abortion protesters will say, yeah, I believe that it's a human being. I just believe that the woman's bodily autonomy supersedes that unborn child's right to bodily autonomy because it's in her body, which kind of ties into, something else that I want to talk to you about, because I know that you've spoken quite a bit on the rights-based arguments that are often made in the abortion debate. And one thing that I was talking with a peer in the pro-life movement, a young person like myself. She was speaking with somebody at a pro-life organization that's pretty well known. They were talking about all of the bills that are coming out now that are making exceptions for, rape, incest, and life of the mother. And a comment was made by a person at this pro-life organization that, well, we should really never expect a mother to have to die for her unborn child. And me and my friend kind of looked at each other like, I kind of think that like ultimately that is the expectation, that like if your mother or your father aren't willing to die for you to save your life, who would be? And so I think that's kind of lost in the conversation, even among the pro-lifers. If you think that it's reasonable to ask a woman to ever give up her life for her unborn child.
Sure. I mean, yeah, I think it's...
And also you're a mother, so I feel like you have like a personal, part to this.
Right. I mean, I do think that women are capable of moral heroism, right? And there are times when our circumstances call us to that. But I guess in some way, the framing is still the problem, right? Because it's almost, you have the pro-abortion framing, which still pits the life of the mother against the life of the child. And, we have to always privilege the life of the mother. But then in the framing where you say we always have to privilege the life of the child, that also pits the two against each other. And so I would want to resist that framing altogether, which, I think that Catholic teaching does in saying that the life of the woman and the mother and the baby are both important, and we have to do everything we can to save both, right? And there are times when that's not possible, right? And in those times, I think there has to be room for discernment and looking at the individual circumstances and seeing what is ethically licit. And also, I just think there's in the messy real life, I guess I would resist these sort of absolutes where it always has to be this way or always has to be this way, because there are times when to save the life of the woman, and it causes an indirect abortion, like cases of ectopic pregnancy, for example. And, the church is pretty explicit that like in cases like that, that is morally illicit, right? So I think the church really tries to resist that framing, which again, I think is a framing that's based in liberalism, right? In this individualistic ethic where we are these individual autonomous monads, basically, and our rights impinge, on other people's rights, and so we have to kind of keep this autonomy. But the whole reality of pregnancy resists that framing. It does not fit. It doesn't fit that model, and so I think the both and approach, both mother and child, and doing everything to support the health of both, even though sometimes in there will be instances that are really rare, but they happen, where that's just not possible.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think most Catholics would say, we absolutely want to do everything to honor the sacred relationship and never pit them against each other. And obviously try to save both, or the life that is more likely to live, I think is how doctors often look at that. But, you brought up moral heroism. And it had me thinking about our culture's obsession with this kind of glorified female heroism that we see in female superhero movies. But it just seems like our culture rejects this like ordinary female self-sacrifice, which is kind of how I see heroism. And so I wanted to know if you had any thoughts on, how you think we got there, whether that was something philosophical that happened or something in culture that really shifted that. Because I see it all over when it comes to women saving the world. But when it comes to something like the situation of abortion, of just sacrificing your own ego or your own selfishness or your own ideal of what you thought your life would look like for your child, it just seems that, those two things are just like not seen as the same.
Well, I guess I'm thinking out loud here, so I haven't done a lot of rumination about this, but just thinking out loud, I do think that American feminism, especially in the second wave, really adopted this ideal of the masculine and an ideal of power for the sake of power, and that's what freedom is, that's what liberation is. And so that masculine ideal I think has been praised by feminism. And so that, in other words, what it means to succeed as a woman or be an amazing woman, to be a liberated woman, it tends to look like being as powerful and strong and capable as a man in kind of technically or stereotypically manly things, right? So I could see how that plays into the feminine superhero thing. And I guess another reason I love the Catholic tradition is that if you look at the moral exemplars and the heroes among the communion of the saints, they tend not to be, I guess, gendered in that way. They're almost always stories of self-sacrifice. Like heroism almost always looks like self-sacrifice rather than domination, which isn't to say there's no room for, sometimes like use of violence in order to defend someone's dignity, right? So I'm not precluding that possibility. But at the same time, I think about like Maximilian Kolbe, and Ina Stein, right? Like both of them died in Auschwitz, and they are heroic, right? Because in a way, their willingness to self-sacrifice is a more powerful witness than simply the exercise of power.
Yes. They realize that their power is actually supposed to be to protect the weak instead of dominate over another. Yeah, like our modern feminism is like obsessed with this woman who charges and leads into battle and leads men and, does something massive on like a grand scale in the world. But when it comes to something like giving up your life for your child, it just seems like they pity that woman, even though that's probably the more heroic sacrifice because it's so personal. Do you think that women should be prosecuted for having an illegal abortion? Because this is something that's going on in the debates, and I'm just curious to see where you stand on that issue.
Well, that's something else I have not thought deeply about. Here's the thing. So I think about these things a lot on the moral and theological and philosophical level. And when it comes to policy, I have to admit I am sometimes not sure what the best or most just policy looks like in a particular circumstance, right? So there are plenty of cases where, morality, like what Catholicism would see as a deeply moral issue, is not criminalized in terms of, government policy. When I think about abortion, I guess my instinct is that I want to see more of a movement that is focused on the local, that is focused on the local community, more of the value of distributism in Catholic social teaching, and that really tries to reform the conscience of women. Because I do think just our nature, the fact that we do gestate life within us, gives us this kind of sovereignty over the unborn child. And that sovereignty should be used, to protect and nurture that life. But I think women's consciences have just been so misinformed and malformed and misshaped on this question. But I don't think this kind of, authoritarian hammer is the way to go about it. Like, I really think the change needs to come in the heart. So I guess that's my first instinct on that question.
Okay. And last one, just because we have less than 2 minutes left, wanted to get your idea on where you think this, because it's interesting. We have this cultural obsession with single motherhood. And I think when it comes to the abortion issue, it's awesome that we are supporting women who are taking care of their children when they might not have the man and the father in the picture. But I do think that this movement towards women having children and co-parenting outside of wedlock, that has become such a trend, especially with my generation. I just wanted to get your thoughts on where you think that comes from as well.
Well, I think that comes from letting men off the hook of the reality of pregnancy, right? I mean, that's what the whole contraception and abortion movement within the sexual revolution, it's ultimately been, I say better in an ironic way here, because I actually don't think it's better for men. I think it's spiritually damaging for men to be let off the hook in this way. But nonetheless, it's given men much more freedom than it has given women. And so I think the root of the problem of single motherhood is, and I think it is a problem of an individual moral failing of a man, but also just our kind of cultural devaluation of the importance of fatherhood. I think that is also, we need a better and stronger narrative and a positive vision of masculinity and fatherhood that talks about, masculine strength being used for the good of nurturing and protecting those who are more vulnerable. And there just isn't that right now. There isn't much of you have kind of the narrative of toxic masculinity, and that's about it, So we need better stories about what it means to be a good man.
Yes, I agree. Thank you, Dr. Favale, for joining us.
Yeah, no problem.
We'll be right back with a man's perspective on this. Stay with us. Terry Schilling up next. Welcome back to The Based Catholic. I'm your host, Jessica Kramer. If you watch Tucker Carlson, which if you're going to watch the news, it's probably the only program I recommend, you've probably seen our next guest appear once or twice. Terry Schilling runs the American Principles Project, which is what he calls the NRA for families. Terry, I'm excited to have you on.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks so much for having me, Jessica.
So just to give you a little background, in our last segment, I asked Dr. Abigail Favale, you might have seen her on Pints with Aquinas, what's contributing to this cultural glorification of single motherhood? You know, kind of think of the Kardashians. And we were talking about how men are often left off the hook. And I guess my hypothesis for why women are opting for this co-parenting trend and these arrangements rather than marriage is the same reason why they've accepted the sexual revolution. And I think it's due to cynicism and an accepting of a low expectations of men. Terry, you're a man, and I wanted to ask you if you have a better diagnosis.
Well, I think there's something to that. I think that there's a lot of ills that are causing these problems with abortion. And ultimately, I do think that it goes back to the failure of men, right? I think that abortion doesn't exist if men are filling their role as God has designed them to fill in our society. Men need to step up to the plate. You know, I don't think really any woman really wants to have an abortion. I think there are plenty of scared women out there who don't know how they're going to provide for a baby. But those fears go away if the father of the child will simply just step up and agree to support the child. And frankly, I don't even think that, look, ideally the father would step up and marry the mother and it's out of wedlock, for example. But even if the father is still willing to be supportive and be supportive of the pregnancy and help raise the child, I think that abortion as an option or as a consideration evaporates. I don't think it's so unnatural to kill your own offspring, right? And that is what abortion is. It's a completely unnatural act that kills the life of your own flesh and blood. And I think that ultimately the reason that this is happening is because fathers and men are not stepping up to the plate and they're allowing women to be taken advantage of by these doctors, by these industries, right, that propagandize and exploit them for profit and political power. And ultimately, I do think that this falls not entirely on the men, but largely on men.
So I wanted to ask your opinion on this idea. So I came across a psychologist that I was talking with, and I was asking him, you know, why men can so easily walk away from their children. And he said that if they're not connected to the mother of the child, if that relationship is not stable, you know, ideally in marriage, that they don't really build that bond and that connection with that child. And so it's so much easier for them to walk away than it would be for a mother to walk away from her kids. So I guess I wanted your opinion on that, if you think that there's any truth to that. And, you know, I mean, obviously getting back to, you know, a Catholic sexual ethic would be ideal in society, but because we live in a secular society, like how do we kind of fix that?
The person you talk to sounds like an expert on psychology and how our minds work. But frankly, I do think that mothers have a much deeper physical connection to their child. I mean, their body is literally creating the entire body of this new human being. There's so many hormones that are going back and forth. They're sharing blood. They're sharing DNA. They're sharing so much. There's actually a lot of studies that show, like, biologically, mothers have all of the DNA of all of their children in their body by the time they die, right? And that's very fascinating. And ultimately, fathers don't have the nurturing role when it comes to raising children. That's a mother's role. And fathers have been programmed to be able and willing to leave their children to go to war, to go to work, to go on ships, to provide for their families. Fathers really have the duty to provide for their children and their families. And men throughout history have been going to war and leaving their families for extended periods of time. And so there's just not that physical attachment that fathers have to their children entirely. But I will say that if there isn't an attachment to the mother as well, it does make that attachment to the child and involvement in the child's life that much more difficult, especially if it's an estranged relationship or a negative relationship between the mother and the father.
Yeah, which I think there's a lot of. I mean, I've witnessed it in my own life with people that I know. One thing that I was talking about with a friend is in this conversation about holding men accountable, it's like we as conservatives notice that men's active role in their children's lives obviously benefit the children growing up, that they need fathers in the homes and they need these men to be in their lives. But what I've noticed after the Dobbs decision was there was such an emphasis on helping these women in these crisis pregnancies. But I felt like there was kind of a missing part of the conversation that should have been geared towards, how do we get these men to step up and take responsibility? And so I wanted to ask, as a man, as a leader in the pro-life movement, are there conversations among some of the male leaders on how they can engage the men in these situations to step up and care for these women so that it's not always the pro-lifers having to take on that burden? We've always talked about how the state becomes the father, when it comes to welfare. But I also feel like the pro-life movement could so easily fill that role.
Well, there's this interesting dynamic at play here ultimately, which is that, if you're a dad and you don't want to have a baby and you don't really care about abortion and abortion is legal, and in your mind, there's an option there, right? I mean, in your mind, the mother doesn't have to keep the baby. In your mind, the mother is not legally required to have the baby. So why do you have any responsibility to that child whatsoever? That's just like how law impacts how we think and how we act. And that's why it's important to make abortion illegal. That will force fathers to get re-engaged in the system. And we have child support laws, we have deadbeat dad laws, we have an entire system in place. But what's happening, I believe, is abortion laws and the legalization of abortion has completely changed the obligations that mothers and fathers owe to their children, which is nothing, essentially. They've erased our obligations. Well, at the same time, the left and our opponents on the other side of the aisle will hypocritically argue that you and I have an obligation to pay for complete strangers to get college degrees, right? To pay for complete strangers to have housing and clothing and shelter. That's our duty to society. Well, you don't really have a duty to society if a mother and a father don't even owe their own child, their own flesh and blood that they created with their own act, 9 months in the womb. And so I think the first step in forcing fathers to get re-engaged and repairing all this is to make abortion as restricted as possible and ultimately illegal down the road.
Yes. Do you also think that, going after birth control next, which, because that's really where this starts, is divorcing children from the procreative act of sex. And so do you think that we really need to change the cultural understanding that, children and procreation are a result of sex and that you really shouldn't be engaging in sex if you're not willing to step up and be a parent?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that we need to get back to our roots as Americans, not just Christians. Americans had a hard time adopting the birth control pill because at the time it was introduced, Americans had internalized that God was in charge of two things primarily: who lives and who dies. And he was in charge of new life that came into the world. And Americans didn't want to play God. And so it took a lot to get Americans to embrace artificial contraception. And ultimately, I do think we need to start looking at ways to show people that contraception is not benefiting our society. It's not even benefiting individuals. It's hurting you. It is turning you into a sex object. It's cheapening your value as a human being and what you bring to the table to our society. So, yeah, I do think we need to have bigger discussions about contraception and how negatively that's impacted our society, how it's made us much more self-centered, much more self-focused, and not instead focused on building a broader community and a stronger nation and society and ultimately strong families.
Yes, I agree. Unfortunately, that is all that we have time for today. Terry, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
There's a show. That's a show.